What makes a city sustainable in the full sense of the word sustainable? Most people think about sustainability as natural processes. I think about sustainability, including natural processes, but social processes, political,
Yes.
economic processes, right? So what is the key to do that? Well, the key is probably have a process that is strong enough to have a strong vision and pursue that vision, but flexible enough to change directions a little while still going towards that vision. So I think that Baltimore had that vision in the beginning. It lost the vision.
Vicente del Rio is a professor of architecture and urban design whose career spans Brazil and the United States. He taught for more than 2 decades at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro before moving to California, where he taught at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and worked extensively on community-based urban design projects. I first discovered Vicente's writing while on a personal quest to understand what happened to a place I once loved and lived in, Inner Harbor in Baltimore, Maryland. In the mid-1980s, Vicente was living and doing research at Johns Hopkins while working for the city of Baltimore, while I was living in Federal Hill, overlooking the harbor, and I walked the perimeter most every day to get to work. We probably crossed paths. We certainly share the experience that we were lucky to live there during a renaissance of massive importance, and share as well our disappointment that it could not be sustained. Today, my colleague Eduardo Dantas, who lives and works in Rio de Janeiro, joins us to add another layer to the conversation, exploring how regenerative marketing can help businesses and governments create value, not just for customers and shareholders, but for the communities they impact. This concept offers fresh perspectives on how places can be marketed while genuinely serving their residents. What began as a personal inquiry into the rise and fall of Baltimore's Inner Harbor evolved into a much deeper exploration of how political systems shape urban development, with Vicente highlighting how Brazil's constitutional commitment to urban development contrasts with America's dependence on private investment for public spaces. As you'll hear, developing vibrant, inclusive urban spaces is full of paradox and contradiction. Public interest must be balanced with economic realities, and visionary leadership must be strong enough and flexible enough to endure political and market pressures over time. When I turn a cynical eye towards these challenges, Vicente is there to gently illuminate what can be seen if we really look, and then he moves us to a place of renewed imagination and possibility. In particular, he shares examples of powerful visual tools that foster a collective community vision, drawing on influential urban theorist Kevin Lynch's concept of mental maps, how residents cognitively organize and perceive their cities. Vicente advocates for embedding social processes into urban design so that the vision becomes accessible and adaptable to the people who live there. He doesn't shy away from offering critique, whether it's about the redevelopment efforts at the Inner Harbor or fundamental differences between U.S. and Brazilian approaches that shape how public spaces are developed and who they serve. This is a long, lingering conversation, but it is chock full. Check out the show notes for more information. We're so glad you're here for this conversation. If you haven't already, be sure to find us at munisquare.substack.com and subscribe to stay connected. Now let's get started. Hello. Well, we were getting warmed up here. You're not late. You're right on time.
Nice to see you both. Good to see pieces behind the name.
Yeah.
So where are you guys exactly based on?
I am in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania on the East Coast, north of Baltimore, maybe an hour and a half.
Yeah. And I'm in Rio. Have you heard about it?
Yeah. So do you work there?
Yeah, I live and work here. I don't teach. Not yet.
Where are you now, Vicente? You are.
I'm in San Luis Obispo. Actually, not San Luis Obispo anymore, but in the county in California, between LA and San Francisco.
And you teach and write. Is that?
The writing part is a byproduct of the teaching job. I taught in Rio for maybe 23 years from 78 to 2001 at the Federal University. I always worked at the same time. For several years, I worked for the state of Rio in planning. Then I had a very brief 1.5 years working with the city. And then when I applied for a full job at the university, I had to leave my jobs outside university. So I started doing consultancy with a couple of friends. They have offices. So I let them worry about the office and I just came in and did the projects with them. And then I moved here 24 years ago, 2001. So I retired from Cal Poly 5 years ago, the year of the pandemic. Our contract allows us to retire and be automatically rehired as an annuitant for a limited amount of time every year during 5 years. So that's what I did. And that's finished now. And I just applied for the Social Security benefits. If
Oh,
they,
how exciting.
if they're going to still exist in the
There's
be
get
a-
them while you can.
So that's the story. Unfortunately, when I moved here, Cal Poly is a very strong teaching institution. So there's not much time to pursue my double life as in Rio, because I always like teaching and work in the same time. So I had to concentrate much more in teaching. But on the other hand, Cal Poly or my department had always have a kind of a line for the studios that we worked for clients. From the third year on, we 99% of the times we have a paid clients that pays for the studio to do work. It's like community outreach. I don't get money out of that, but it's a way to be with a foot on practice, right? So that's
Mhm.
it's nice for the students also.
Yeah. I really enjoyed this book. I just like the way you put it together. It's the way I like to read. I can move around in the book back and forth and get ideas and connect ideas. Just this morning, I read the chapter on adolescents getting their input. I thought that was a terrific chapter. There's another contributor in Muni Square in Copenhagen. She's working with local governments. They bring together the adolescents and they gather artists and they kind of visit the different spaces around the communities. They're more of the lower income communities and maybe spaces that were blighted, and they just sort of reimagine, what would you do with this space? It reminded me of that. Really cool.
Thank you, Nancy. So you're the one that's been buying the book besides myself, right? That's good.
Yeah,
Good to-
I just adore books. I mean, you're so generous with your website, but it's, I like tabs. I put tabs. I like to mark it
Yeah.
up so I can refer back to it. So, yeah, I'm a book person. I just prefer
Good. So
it
too, and
that
I
way.
like open the books, read the books, mark the books, smell the books.
Yeah, and the pictures you have in there are really helpful too. As I mentioned in my intro, I was reading, the book about Seeing Through the Eyes of the State by James Scott, and he's talking about City of Brasilia. And of course, I'm thinking, oh, I wonder if anything is in Vicente's book about that. So I go through and I connect those ideas, and we'll get in a little bit of that today, I hope. But I think your perspective coming from inside, entering this field, how did you get in the field? You must have been influenced by ideas early on. I'm curious whether, you and Eduardo, like when you grow up with this is the dominant idea of your country, is that something you just assume that's the way you do it? This is what's good? Or did you early on question whether this was a design you would carry forward? Those things interest me. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to do a little marketing of myself because there's another book I published in 2009, which is
Mhm.
called Contemporary Urban Design in Brazil, Beyond Brasilia, which was an attempt. When I got here, I realized there's a very little understanding of what happens in Brazilian cities. The only thing people knew was Brasilia, right? Brasilia was the thing and modernism. So I put together a little project and invited several collaborators from different cities in Brazil to write about what was going on in the field. Unfortunately, at the time, I was a little over optimistic with what was happening in Brazil at that time with the new legislation, new constitution, new government, and I was much more positive than I am now. So the book has that positive approach, but I think it's a good book because it shows what São Paulo, Rio, Belo Horizonte, Porto Alegre, and several cities were Salvador were trying, or examples of projects in those cities, right? So it's like, look, people, Brazil is not only Brasilia, and it's not only Curitiba, right? There's something else going on.
I look forward to that. That sounds really interesting.
And
Yeah.
it's available on Amazon. It's by the University of Florida Press.
Yeah.
Anyway, right.
So many aspects. And I don't know if Eduardo, again, just warm up here. I think, Eduardo and I started working together. He was helping me with developing some value propositions for my local government clients. I work primarily with organization development, always around government. This is just one of those areas of interest that caught hold. I'm at an age where I give myself a lot of leeway. When I have curiosity, I just go with it. I have enough knowledge to go with that. I don't have expertise beyond, but I have enough to ask questions. In working with Eduardo, we started thinking about even local governments need to do a better job at understanding their value proposition. That's probably a whole nother topic to discuss that. But I think it's interesting. And I said before you came on, some of the work you wrote about with images, like images that are used in the way cities present themselves, how they choose those images. And it just occurred to me that from an urban designer viewpoint versus maybe a marketer or somebody who specializes in marketing like Eduardo, there's a lot to learn from one another. What is important? What are the questions from an organization development person? What are the questions we need to be asking for that community, for those leaders to really, who do we want to be? How do we want to present ourselves? And how is it that we're going to develop a presence here? I guess in the words of the community, they want to attract, whether it's tourists, they want to attract business, they want to attract whatever their thing is. Eduardo, I don't know if you want to say something more about that. This has kind of been a new venture for you as well. Maybe you could mention the two gentlemen you introduced to me with the regenerative marketing. I wonder if Vicente has heard of them.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard about this concept of regenerative marketing. And there's a book by Philip Butler with Enrico Foglia and Christian Sarkar. The concept is based on the following. You can use company assets to help communities, not only to produce profits. You can have a value proposition for your customer, but in regenerative marketing, you also have a value proposition for the communities we are working with. So if you are installed in a specific place, you can have a value proposition for the community you are most impacting with your presence there. Right. And this is the basic concept of regenerative marketing. And all the business model can be built from that idea in generating value, not just for customers and not just for the shareholders, but also for the community that is part of this huge group of stakeholders. And when we talk about value proposition, we commonly talk about customers. The definition of marketing by Philip Kotler is to create, communicate, and deliver value for a target market, to a target market for a profit. If we take this concept and adopt a broader view, we can generate value propositions for the community because we have communities and they have needs. And their needs must be analyzed and researched first. At the very moment where you start to talk with people and bringing them to the discussions, you are creating expectations and you are involving them. But what we see is that sometimes people get them to talk about these needs, but they don't continue to work with this after this initial research. So often the planned project has nothing to do with the needs you have researched about.
Well,
That's it.
I don't know that book specifically, but I know Philip Kotler's work, particularly
Yeah.
Marketing Places, which is a very old book that was published in Brazil. One of the co-authors in Brazil is a great friend of mine because he worked with Philip Kotler. And I think that what you're pointing out is also premise of the first book, which is when you start thinking about how can you market a place or how can you market cities, you have to start by understanding what that place or city has to offer, right? Nowadays, at least here, you cannot do any plan or project without full public participation, not only at the beginning in collecting their needs and wants, but also in approving the final project. That's one of the reasons why I was very surprised when Nancy sent me that article on Baltimore to see that terrible image of the development of one of the most beautiful projects I have ever seen. Beautiful not only aesthetically, but in what it brought to people. So I think that the notion of regenerative marketing, as you're saying, it looks like it's simply the idea of finding out what the place has to offer and what the community has to offer and try to revitalize or regenerate that community. The problem with the marketing approach I see, and I didn't invent this, actually, it's in the book I mentioned to you that I published about contemporary urbanism in Brazil. It's a friend of mine called my attention years ago when we were discussing marketing places. She was from Curitiba, and she was very critical of the Jeremy Lerner approach because there's a lot of positive things, right? But they were very good at marketing their city. So their marketing people were excellent in which they managed to market the key projects, right? And key novelties and key things that would attract people's attention to the city. This is great. And then they'll come out with another one. The tubular stations, they're great. The express buses, they're great. According to her, and I do understand that this type of, let's call that planning system or planning approach, they need a novelty every now and then to sustain development. So I think if you think about that and try to use that lens to understand Baltimore and Nancy from our conversation through emails, I understand you've been there, you know the place and everything else. I mean, I was there in a very crucial moment that all the stars were aligned, right? I think Baltimore managed to do that for a while, and then it exhausted. The process seems to have exhausted, and there's not much novelty you can do if all the other cities imitated you in your process. So it looks like by the scope of that image, they lost the leaders that had a vision. They don't care about the initial vision. They don't know what to do with it. And now they are proposing a full market approach to get as much money as they can. And the place is going to be looking like Osaka or whatever, right, in Japan.
Yeah.
I think that one of the problems with that type of approach is that you have to have a community understanding of the vision, and you have to have very long processes of implementation that go beyond the political times, right? So it's not only 4 years, not only 8 years. It's like, look at, I mean, Nancy, you know, Baltimore. I mean, it took from the late 50s until the 80s to be kind of ready, right? There were certain key factors and key champions to move that forward that we don't see now. I have a great admiration. I never met the guy, but I know a little bit of what he did. James Rouse, right? James Rouse was a total capitalist, which had an ethical approach to development, right? So he understood that if he made people life better, he would be gaining with that as well. So it's like, if you look at Colombia, if you look at Reston, if you look at all the development projects he did at that time, when he was at the helm of the Rouse Company, they're great. In Baltimore, I read that he basically sat down at the harbor place, looking at people movements to understand how high and how far from the sea, from the sea or from the water people should be. He had this vision, which was almost like let's observe people to understand how to design for them. So I think that's genius. Which developer nowadays would do that?
Hmm.
I understand, for instance, another thing, Nancy, that you probably know, there was a lot of opposition to building the harbor place in the beginning. One of the very smart ways to deal with the community was that, hey, I guarantee that we're going to give out spaces for all the minorities in the city. So with that political move, he invented the marketplace in which you can find.
And that's what it was. You would go in and there was one of a kind. You could
Yes.
go down from one end to the other and it would be one of a kind stalls of people with
Greeks and African Americans and Indian, everybody was represented there. That was incredible. And then he realized that, oops, I have so much leftover space in the lobbies and corners. Let's rent it out for small cars for people for small times, right? Small. So he invented another thing.
This is so complex in the sense that that's why I wanted to narrow it down, maybe to that inner harbor. But I also know you worked a little bit on some of the Fells Point planning. Is that right?
You want the full story of that?
Well, I connect the two because what I feel like happened is it's almost like predatory. There was a rush. I mean, those neighborhoods, I would love to tell stories. You were, Little Italy and Little Poland, and then you had Fells Point. You could belly up to the bar with steamed seafood for affordable prices. That's all gone.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm sure you understand what happened, but it's almost like the what the Inner Harbor first created, that Renaissance, produced all of this other speculative development. I don't know how else to put it, but you ran into resistance to your ideas. And if you would share some of that, it might be helpful to understand. And my main question is, why did the harbor place have to go down? Just because all these other areas were getting developed.
I think that I'm not a Baltimore expert. I
Yeah.
think there were a couple of issues. I remember soon after I left, Mayor Schaefer, who was the key figure on all that, controversial, but a main character who pushed that forward, decided to become governor. So he left
Yeah.
the city and the city elected new people that replaced everybody that used to be key factors. They started doing different things. The lack of continuity was one problem, right? But
That's a good way to put it.
and we did Fells Point because it was a beautiful neighborhood that was going to be destroyed by the extension of the I-95, right?
They were just going to plow it right down.
And when I
Crazy.
got there, there had been a crisis and all the architects had left from the urban renewal department, which was in charge of Fells Point. I was there just for an exchange program, right? They said, oh, you're an architect, so you're going to be doing the waterfront plan for Fells Point West. Check out what we have done because there's a lot of problems with what we have. So let's think of that, have another vision. That's what I did. And the idea was, how can you make that place better, continue to be unique, and how can we connect that to the Inner Harbor? The reflections of the Inner Harbor success were already happening in Fells Point. That was the idea. The problem is that once Fells Point is successful, then everybody wants to replicate that and profit on that success. So you have Harbor East, which is much more intense than everything else. And then you can't stop capitalism, right? So people have start developing Fells Point in a different way. I think that perhaps the city was not smart enough to devise mechanisms to keep the original owners or regional retail in place by perhaps offering them tax abatements or whatever to keep the original people there.
You could see almost like this, the more the commercial chain restaurants went in and stores. The more they increased, the lower you saw the local places. I'm not sure what the formula is that makes that happen.
Nancy, it's happening in San Luis Obispo as well. It's the same thing. Once the city becomes more successful and more attractive, I can give you an example. My daughter used to work for a local boutique, one of these tourist traps that was downtown in an old building. When the owner of that building decided to renew the lease went like 3, 4 times more expensive than it used to be. The woman that owned that little shop left, and some fancy Turkish coffee place came to replace it. So it's happening all the time here.
Everywhere. Before we move to the Rio experience, if we think about the Baltimore experience and how it first spread with a lot of success, based on my reading of Klaus Philipson, which I hope to talk to as well, Baltimore has been depleted. It reached a peak and then it could not recover. I'm very curious about the planning. Perhaps there wasn't the capacity to know how to control zoning or planning, the principles of those expansions. They just replicated one after the other. You had this series of neighborhoods, new restaurants, and the waterfront being developed by private clubs, like yacht clubs. So you couldn't have access to the water like you used to. So is that something that, from your experience at other port city with Rio, even Lisbon, I know I've visited there, but I can't be a good critic because I just was impressed. And I'm sure I'd be, very impressed by Rio too. It was only the fact that I lived in Baltimore that I could see the underbelly, what was happening. I do wonder, and this is important for my work, as to what kind of questions need to be asked when this development starts in these local governments. Outside of Philadelphia, I work with a lot of communities. What are the kinds of questions, the kinds of education, the kinds of capacity building, I think is the word. What kind of capacity building does there need to be in order for good planning and good urban design to take place? Maybe if we back up a little bit and have you tell us your learning curve, what made you aware in pursuit of urban development, your career in urban development, what were the things that drove you or disturbed you or inspired you from your experiences, first in Rio or other places?
Is the you singular or plural? You are asking us.
I'm asking you, Vicente.
Oh my gosh.
And then Eduardo and I we get to ask questions here.
Okay. I guess that I'm more and more aware that, especially after I moved to the United States, that I guess the political dimension is everything. One of the major differences between the US, Brazil, and Europe or Portugal is the political system, the political economical system. I think that in Brazil, especially in Europe, people are much more accustomed to embrace social goals. So I think that democracy is as I think Churchill said, that it's a bad system, but nobody invented a better one, right? So I think that in Europe, Brazil, despite the political problems, I think that we're more used to seeing the state invest much more money into the good of the people. It's written in the Brazilian constitution. We even have a chapter on urban development. In the US, if you don't have private money going into everything, it doesn't move. For instance, people say, let's have a wonderful train system. Well, but we can't do it because we need private interest. And there's no private interest in the train system, right? And here it's like, oh my gosh, the government's going to spend all that money building a train. Look at what's happening in California. They take so long to do that fast train in Central Valley that it's like, 3, 4 times more expensive than I thought. Anyway, I'm rambling here. Although in Brazil, the political system is complicated, there's a lot of corruption, blah, 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 blah. People are more used to have, okay, let's do this and let's see the social consequences. And of course, it's And like maybe what Kotter would say is that, okay, with regenerative marketing is like, okay, we see all this community. Regenerating the community means we have to make something good for them, but also good for the investors, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think I'm diverting so much from the original.
No, I know this is a contemplative question, sensing that when you began in this field, this was the connection you saw. So there could be a difference in the field. We have some really, I think, amazing, ambitious urban designers in this country right now, and transportation designers, but they're struggling. I think in this country, it's the developers who are running the show. One of the things I have in my local government with my clients is that they feel like they're supposed to host these developers, court them, bring them in, because this helps the tax base for the community. From your perspective, how you grew up, that's not the order of things. The order should be, what is our social needs here?
Right. But Nancy, I also learned the hard way in the last year or so with the elections is that I think the American public is not really ready to change that much. I think that if you get I mean, San Luis Obispo is an island of progressive minds. We have several in the States, but you go outside these islands, people are very into their own ideals. Like, for instance, take the very small subject of parking. In San Luis Obispo, it's a 45,000 city. The downtown is very attractive to tourism. It's changing a lot. And the city has been trying to implement more housing downtown. They had built 1, 2, 3 parking structures around the core for people to park and walk to their destinations. It used to be the case that the first hour was free, or first couple of hours, to kind of incentivize people to go there. And you see people, oh, wow, there's no parking downtown, right? Oh, I have to walk 2 blocks to get to my destination. So a lot of the successes of downtown businesses is measured by parking. And it's still complex like that. The idea of public transportation is very complicated. And that's what, Nessie, we differ from Europe and from Brazil. It's like, okay, the state is not ready to invest in good public transportation, like a good bus system in Curitiba. You have to invest heavily for 5 years or 4 years. That's beyond the political period, right? So it's complicated. Car owners are going to say, oh, no, I want better roads. I'm not going to be buying a bond to increase public transportation because I'm not going to use it. So it's very complicated.
How is it different in Rio?
I guess Eduardo can answer that better than me because I'm just a tourist in Rio now. Brazil is a federal system to start with, so it's easier to implement things that are cross states than here. The mayor has a lot of power in Brazil, in Rio, and much more than here. The mayor can do, I mean, the mayor, that's good and bad at the same time. A mayor gets elected, then it changes everybody in the city structure, just like Trump is doing here. Changes everybody that's going to support him, right? And then the next mayor comes, same thing happens. So it's very difficult to have continuity. It's easier for them to implement stuff. So we had a mayor just before the military were kicked out that implemented, for me, one of the best revitalization projects I have ever seen, which is the cultural corridor in Rio de Janeiro, which was great. And there was public participation with local retail business people. It was a great project, but I think that it only happened because it was a strong mayor that decided to come down from his pedestal and talk. I mean, the planners suggested, he agreed, and they went down with the local business people, got together and implemented the project. Of course, 2 rounds after that, the project was fucked up because the new mayor decided to do something else. Anyway, but it's...
Well, what about transportation? Eduardo, are you car dependent where you are?
By far, the car is the most used transport for us. We have a train system, and a subway system. The subway system is very clean and it's very good for those who use, but it's also very limited because the system can't reach all the areas. And Rio de Janeiro has some geographic peculiarities. We are surrounded by mountains and the sea.
Mm.
And it's not so easy because we have a very concentrated area in the south zone where the prices are the higher to build anything or to buy an apartment or a house. And then you have all the rest of the city that want to move to downtown, which is next to South Zone, and you have to get people there. For this, you have urban transportation, buses, train, and subway. But the problem is too many people for small areas, right?
Hmm.
I think that nowadays, after pandemic, you don't have so many people getting to one place from one place to the other, right? Nowadays, downtown is almost abandoned in some areas. The mayor is trying to revitalize some areas in downtown.
Are there similarities like with what we were
Yeah,
talking about Baltimore? You develop and everybody goes there and then I don't know, they say, okay, we've been there. So now they go someplace else or pricing gets too high, housing costs get too high. So they move out. Like there's a constant way beyond the scope of our conversation today. But as a designer, I think that maybe there's that utopian sense of we want some kind of mix. We want something that's going to have sustainability, that there's enough here.
Yeah, I think that's the key. And I guess I was positive when I wrote about that article in Baltimore. What makes a city sustainable in the full sense of the word sustainable? Most people think about sustainability as natural processes. I think about sustainability, including natural processes, but social processes, political,
Yes.
economic processes, right? So, what is the key to do that? Well, the key is probably have a process that is strong enough to have a strong vision and pursue that vision, but flexible enough to change directions a little while still going towards that vision. So I think that Baltimore had that vision in the beginning. It lost the vision because key figures left. Maybe the key people are super important in the vision. New York had a couple key people who had interesting visions, and New York reinvented itself in our field a lot, right? With the High Line, with the Little Island, a lot of things that happened, which, I mean, it's a huge metropolis, right? But those things were transformative. At some point, Seaport was also a little transformative. Battery Park.
What about Lewis Mumford? I don't know how much of his work you've looked at, but what I took from his ideas, and I think it's been replicated, it's this idea that there is, you don't just take the same planned community and then boom, 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 do it over and over again. Each area has to think like an organism. It's its own identity. It's that this is going back to Eduardo conversations. Like if I think about my local government, I would want each one to have its own feeling for place. This is our place and why it's our place. I don't want it to look exactly like the one next door. Look how prosperous it is. We're going to make a shopping center just like it. 30 miles down the road, what I see is just a total lack of imagination. It's this idea that this is the best practice. Once we became so rational, planning became about you need these many roads or these many parking spaces for these kinds of developments. And they just kept making these plans, selling them to local governments that this is what you need, instead of what we're talking about with sustainability is what you started out with, the social processes. And I just don't think people know what to do with that idea. We can say what we felt like at attachment to Baltimore. That was not just a feeling, it was a functionality. I could live there right out of college. I could afford to live right on that harbor, thrive, no car.
Well, in that harbor, I remember when I was there, or soon after or before, I don't know. But you probably remember a very big residential block tower that is maybe a couple of piers down from the power station. That's kind of looks like a wedding cake,
Yes.
very ugly. When they built that, nobody wanted to buy an apartment there because they were asking prices and it was so ugly. Who would like to live there, right? Nowadays, look at it, right? Unfortunately, one of the things that I think Baltimore lacked along the waterfront is bringing in more people like us who could pay for it, right? Maybe I should have bought an apartment in Fells Point at that time. And in my other lives, I would end up living in Baltimore because I was invited to work there. But anyway,
Where did you live?
I took a UP Express because I was doing research at Johns Hopkins at the same time. So I had a small efficiency apartment that belonged to Johns Hopkins. I took the bus downtown every time I had to go to work for the city. So I was doing research at Hopkins and working with the city. So I bet you're more confused than before.
For me, some of the goals from our conversation is to be able to translate some of these ideas when I'm engaged, let's say, with strategic planning with cities. They proudly show their developments. They show this is going to be a tax base. And who am I to say that they shouldn't have these investments into their municipalities? At the same time, I'm sympathetic for the planners, and I would like to have a better understanding, be able to ask better questions or help them ask better questions, particularly when the developers are on the board.
Yeah, Nancy, let me give you an example that popped up in my mind right now. So when I came to St. Louis 2001, in 1990s, there were 3 or 4 local architects and one designer, Eduardo. One of the guys was a designer that got together and developed this concept plan for downtown. It was one poster with the plan of downtown, some perspectives, and on the back, a lot of writing. And the mayor at the time liked that, and somehow that got bought by the community. So people would hide those posters and use them in their walls. Downtown businesses would have that. That was like a vision, not a plan, because it had no legislature force, but it was a plan that even the developers sat down and looked at it and discussed that and bought into that. So all the legislation that followed kind of respected that concept. So a couple of years ago, I was elected a member of this ad hoc commission to help the city review that plan, right? So we had the city, we evolved, of course, and there was a firm that was hired to do a lot of the groundwork. So there were several community outreach meetings, several community outreach events downtown. We rewrote the principles. We can send you the document that came out of that. We did another poster, another document, much more complete. It's a vision that allows people to understand how the future will be. In Baltimore, I remember one of the things that struck me when I was there was that there was a 1979 poster with a perspective of the whole downtown and all the volumes expressing the colors of the volumes. I remember the white volumes were buildings that were designed and either were approved or what the legislation was expecting the buildings to look like. And the brown buildings were existing buildings, some of them protected. The brown buildings with a white line around, were buildings that are going to be recycled. The rational planning idea that you mentioned, Nancy, kind of got away from that into kind of words. All this legislation, all this lawyerism, right? That, the city will be, and people don't understand that. I think that if you can sell that to people, they can embrace a vision, it's easier to implement anything, right?
Well, you just described what Baltimore needs to do right now. So this This is a brilliant idea. I would love to see that. So here's this new vision that they have published that bears, to me, no resemblance to notes which I've taken. I've listened to their community engagement meetings. Okay. The notes here, connectivity, access to the water, connecting the water to the people. We want a place that's going to, energize us, bring back small businesses. And then in big letters, local, all these engagement groups, they want local. People want to be able to walk, eat, drink, enjoy arts and entertainment culture. And there needs to be some imagined drawings, scenarios taped right back up on that mural. Like, this is where that's going to happen. This is what this could look like. Right here is going to be where we're going to have local entertainment, or we're going to have local food venues, or we're going to have this. I think about in Rio de Janeiro when they made the streets pedestrian. I mean, that was brilliant. Like, wouldn't that be cool if they made Key Highway pedestrian to give people access? There's just a complete disconnect. We're speaking as outsiders here. We confess that. But still, that vision of what's to be, I don't see any connection with everything that I watched from the community engagement.
Yeah. And I remember one of the major points in the Baltimore Harbor plan was to allow people's access to the water, which was a big attract. At that time, nobody thought about that, because the water was where people would just throw sewage. Port cities turned their backs toward water because that was dirty, right? And I think Baltimore was more successful in doing that. Let's turn towards the water, because that's one of the basic elements that we have inside us, right? So it has a very, very strong attraction. So I think they had that in the original plan. They had the idea of keeping buildings low, having this cone of light and sun access to the inner harbor. It's totally lost, and people could see where the sea was going to. I guess perhaps the major problem that Baltimore never solved was the disconnect between the haves and the nots. At the same time, they were doing this wonderful inner harbor. A lot of the neighborhoods were still very much down. I don't know if the implementation of the light rail made that better, but I think that differences between the good neighborhoods and the bad neighborhoods did not get much better with the inner harbor. So the inner harbor really didn't spread out the profits. And I think that perhaps that's difficult in this capitalist world. It is like, how can you get developers to provide housing that's not expensive for normal people to go live downtown or to go live near the water, right? Maybe the city should have thought about that and should have made a stock of lands along the river so that they could later provide lower income, affordable housing along the river. I don't know. But then you have to have a very long range vision for that.
Where I lived was on Federal Hill. I always say that I started at the top, and since then I've gone downhill with all of my real estate. I was just renting at a home that was eventually sold for a lot of money. Behind that, my housemate bought another house, and if you kept going back towards Fort McHenry, there's just neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood where there were row houses.
Mm-hmm.
Philipson writes about that too. He said those row houses are very good sources of affordable housing.
What I think the city did with the Otterbein neighborhood was brilliant. An incredible operation, right? You could buy a house for $1.
Yeah.
As long as you renovated it. So that was how much those houses are worth nowadays, right?
Yeah.
But
so I think your idea is brilliant about the mural. And I think also, just to tag back on the conversation about adolescence, the engagement, if you were to put up a big mural that this is what the vision of Baltimore is, the idea of what are adolescents going to do there? Because that used to be, they'd bring their skates down and their
Uh-huh.
bikes. Where are they going to be? I really want to understand what it is that they see. Why the height? What is the reason for the height of those buildings? Is it just a need to make enough money to
I mean, it's not the first
sustain?
project of that kind, Nancy. I remember looking at a couple of them. One was the expansion of the conference center, development of
Yeah.
the stadium, and across where they had the civic center. And also, when they took out the mechanics theater, they did the multi-story building over there. It's probably ready by now.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there's a market for all that.
I do too. I guess one of my takeaways from this conversation today, though, is what you said about the social processes. I do think in our country, we're very good at selling, but we're not so good at realizing those visions. In other words, we know what's going to attract people to a mixed use community, but the idea is quite different from the reality. And I don't know if that happens in Brazil, like where you have a mixed use community. It's just like we were talking about with globalization. You travel far to arrive at a city that looks just like this other city because they've developed a shopping complex with stores that you could see at home, restaurants you see at home, same design kinds of ideas. Here's a mixed use village. Here's a beautiful retirement community. It just looks like a cruise ship. It looks so wonderful and inviting, but it doesn't have any of the social processes, none of that planning, none of that feel to it once you go live there.
But Nancy, I think that I'm going to be a little bit sorry, Eduardo. I joke
Okay.
that all the time. But
Okay.
it's my professor persona.
No, please, please.
We are here for it.
I think that talk about the U.S. population, and I might be saying stupid things because as the British would say, I'm a bloody foreigner, right? But I suspect there's a large part of the population, and Eduardo, as a marketing guy, can perhaps confirm that they expect to see other places as something in the zoo, right? They want to be protected and have the experience from the outside. That's why some people go to Lisbon or Romania or whatever and stay in a Hilton or stay in a Sheraton, which is the same one that's going to be in Rio in whatever, right? I don't stay in Hiltons because it's very expensive, but also because it's not what I want, right? And that brings me back to comments I always hear. It's like, oh, we cannot do this here. Oh, that's in Europe. We cannot do here in the States. It would never work in the States.
Yeah.
Right? That's something I repeatedly hear. It's like, when you go to Europe, don't you think that's attractive? But here, you can't do that. How can you do that complex urban design if we have cars here, right? So, okay, so we got to have spaces for cars. And then you mix that with the legislative approach of, oh, wow, if you want to have a shop, you have to have 15 parking spaces next to the shop.
Yeah.
If you want to have a bank, you need to. So it's very complicated. The public wants to take their car and park at that shopping.
And I'm guilty. I am guilty of that. I know there's another way. I don't know how to get there.
No, me too. You see, I used to live in Leblon, and my mother, we left, and she died 5 years ago. She lived in a block that, like, 2 blocks around her block, she could find 3 small shopping centers, and she could take a bus to anywhere in the city or a taxi, whatever. Mobility was not a problem because she couldn't drive anymore. I lived in a neighborhood, not downtown, but in the city of San Luis Obispo for 23 years in the same HOA that I could walk to a Trader Joe's, a market in like maybe 3 blocks. Ask me if I ever walked there. Because it was so easy to get my car, drive 3 blocks and park
Easy.
and get my groceries in the car, right? it's a catch-22 situation. You want to encourage people to walk, but then you're offering easy parking so people do not walk. When people are older, maybe they can't walk. Does the market offer a free home delivery system or a cheap one? No, it doesn't.
Well, here would be my final plea on this note. When I was reading what you wrote about Rio, where there's public space, and this is taxpayer dollars, investment, that's what we had at the Inner Harbor.
Right.
And at that time, you could walk to the harbor and get food. You could take a bus. That was public money. To me, that's the line in the sand that we have to fight for. Is that where there's public parks and public monies invested, don't disturb that with speculative development, which precludes and disincentivizes us from using those shared park spaces. I mean, I want to find an ability for us as Americans to understand and draw examples and attention to the value of our tax dollars going into these public spaces and then being converted to a money-making machine. Inner Harbor went into receivership, which has complicated the outcome. I know a little bit about this. Once that happens, the rules change. So they didn't have a competitive bidding process to get out of debt.
I think you're right. Reminded me of an experience I had, which shocked me. Years ago, I was working with a friend of mine, his office. We got this big project, a master community, master plan. We got associated with the SWA group from the States to develop that master plan. And we are doing something along a local lake. I was fighting for us to have a road along the edges to make it public, right? And the owners or the developers expressed to us, we don't want that because we don't want people that don't belong here to come park their cars and enjoy the lake. So we don't want the desirables to be able to come here by bus and invade our space.
I think that's true in a lot of places.
And I remember, Eduardo, you might remember when Leonardo Brizola, it's a long story, but when he came back from exile and was elected governor of Rio, he was a socialist. And one of the things they did was they started implementing bus lines from the suburbs to the beaches. So that people from the suburb could be easier access to the beaches. And there was a big movement against that by the elites because they didn't want people from the outside to invade their beaches, although all the beaches are public, right? So it's interesting because you can use certain things to prevent the undesirable to access space, which should be public. And you're right. I mean, I think at that time, people could go and enjoy the waterfront, even if you didn't buy anything, right?
Yeah.
It is a democratic space. One of the most beautiful things in Rio is the beach because you can see everyone there for every class.
I think Nancy knows more than I do, but it's state by state. But in Brazil, there's a national law from 1898 that makes a big band along every beach and every body of water public by definition.
Yeah.
So you cannot, theoretically, you cannot wall it from public access. Here, it depends on the state, it depends on the situation. So
there are some people who want to change that.
Yeah, I know that. The reality is that they don't respect that. It's not the case of Baltimore. You have to negotiate with every developer.
Well, we covered a lot of territory here, and I'm glad we didn't stick too closely to the outline. I think we left a few things for another conversation, but I would like to see what I can make of our material today.
Good luck.
And if you could send, was it St. Louis, the example that you gave? Was that the city that did the...
I think I have, maybe it's even in the booklet. Let me see something here.
I just love this example. And it could be useful at all different levels. I could see in any kind of planning, visioning process for a community.
Nancy, I was going to say, one of the reasons I got involved in it, it's a long story, but I'm involved or helping the county to review the plan for the central part of the suburb I live now. And
Uh-huh.
I convinced the local representative and the county to involve our studios in California. So what they want to do with the studios, and that's one of the reasons why they hired us or them, is that certain things in the original plan have been implemented, certain things have not been implemented. And before updating the plan, they want us to explore particularly 3D images of how the place could be like in the future to show the community, right? So the community needs to understand with concrete imagery how the
Yeah.
place could be. And that's important for them to support a vision. So I think that is key. Everybody's visual, right? You want to see.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a very powerful takeaway. Just trying to resolve the bigger question of in Baltimore, what this projection of the future is in comparison to what the community said that they would like to have. Quite frankly, when I listen to them, I think they're just remembering the past. They're remembering the way it used to be. That's what they want, the way it was. But we're talking about the future. It's a different world. We have to help people see that future too. Go ahead, Eduardo.
No, because we talked a lot about vision, right? And just the point that this vision must be a collective vision, not an individual vision.
Yeah. I mean, Nancy, are you aware of, for me, one of the key authors, one of the guys I fell in love with urbanism when I was in third year of my architecture program is Kevin Lynch. Kevin Lynch has a fundamental book called The Image of the City. His professor was one of the people who applied Gestalt to architecture and came from the Bauhaus to the States.
Wow.
Kevin Lynch is very important in my field because he was the first to think about how people perceive space and perceive the city and how people form images of the city. He called them mental maps. Psychologists call that cognitive mapping, right? So mental maps. And I think that Lynch used to say that every city has a public mental map, a collective sum of all individual mental maps. And it's interesting to approach planning like that. It's that how is current mental map of people? What is the image that people make when you say San Francisco? What is San Francisco for people? It has so many things that are similar to marketing, right? So what is San Francisco for people? How do people structure San Francisco in their minds and navigate San Francisco? Let's make that stronger or let's change that. I think that Baltimore at that time managed to do that. I just wanted to mention that to you. There's a big area in planning, what we call environmental perception or environmental behavior field, which studied how people behave, how people perceive the city, and how they use that in their day-to-day basis, right?
Yeah, that really interests me. If I could start college again, there's a lot of interesting directions. I so appreciate the conversation today. I'm going to bring some ideas together. I may just use some clips from this. I may rearrange the ideas a little bit, but also, Vicente, I'll keep you posted, everything we do with this. And do you think you would be open to another conversation at a future point if we were to come up with something that looked like we had some more to talk about?
Sure.
Great.
Pleasure.
Thanks. All right. We're just getting started with the Muni Square, but I really think there's a lot of interesting ideas coming together. So I would love to keep you in the conversation if that's something that would interest you as well. Thank you so much for taking the time today. Yeah.
And I think, Nancy, one idea maybe for you could be, it just occurred to me, it'll be interesting to have maybe a round table, if you can, gather a couple of people. Maybe Eduardo can arrange somebody from the city of Rio to be here. We can have somebody from Baltimore, Europe. Would be great.
Do you think the theme of port cities would be the thing that tied it together? Because we didn't really get into that today, but I feel like it's important.
I think it's an important theme always. Another idea is the notion of regeneration or revitalization of urban spaces or urban areas that you can tackle waterfronts, downtowns, or anything, or maybe that's a little too wide. Maybe you can have a series of conversations, right?
Yeah.
One all on regeneration. Let's call it urban regeneration, right?
Yeah.
And then one can be waterfronts. The other one can be downtowns. The other one can be commercial corridors, residential spaces. There's a lot that you can think about, or even sustainability, if that's a
Yeah.
catchword.
I like your idea. And you may know some people to recommend as well as Eduardo. It might take a little time to get together the right mix and put together an outline, but that would definitely be of interest. I'm sure Eduardo would love to do that too. If it's
Yeah.
online, virtual, we can do it.
Nancy, perhaps your answer occurred to me. In our field, there's an important author called John Turner, who was one of the main figures to defend the idea of self-help housing. And he wrote a book in which it's about housing for people. The title of the book is Housing for People Towards Autonomy in the Built Environment. He defends the idea that the state has to be the enabler of things, right? I think that if you think about it, perhaps the key item here is how can local governments be enablers of things, enablers of communities, enablers of revitalization or whatever, right? Because that's a major role of any government is to enable people to do whatever people want to do, right? It's enabling people. And if you think of sustainability, it's about how can you make that sustainable? How can you enable that process?
Thank you. I'm going to pursue those suggestions and I will give this some thought and let's talk more.
Thank you very much.
That's great.
It was nice meeting you, Eduardo. Thank you for finding me, Nancy.
When I found you, I was like, Eduardo, you're not going to believe who I just found.
Eduardo, you're not going to believe
I'm
that my second name is Eduardo.
Really?
Ah,
Yeah.
Oh, great.
This is
Didn't know
Eduardo.
that.
Okay,
Very
guys. Thank you very much.
see you. Have a great week.
You too.
Take care.
Bye.
Eduardo will be in
Eduardo.
touch
Nice to
soon.
meet you. Bye. Take care.